Okay, I managed to liberate Admiral Moore from an interview by Vago, so you can start out by giving me credit for getting us started somewhat on time. This morning, Admiral Moore was introduced to an SRO crowd on shipbuilding. This afternoon, he and his panel are going to talk about maintenance. We started out this symposium with the SWO boss talking about how important maintenance was, how important it was to get rid of the backlog. Along the way, Vice Admiral Dixon Smith talked in his discussion of facilities and installations specifically about how to renew the waterfront, working on the resilience of shipyards and making investments in things that would facilitate maintenance. And then, of course, the Vice Chief said the Navy wants maintenance money before the Navy wants shipbuilding money. And I think to the operational sailors, many of whom were present at lunch as the awardees for the Surface Navy Association, I think in their minds that would be the right kind of priority too. Admiral Moore, obviously since June, has been the commander of the Naval Sea Systems Command. He is someone who is an extraordinary engineer, an extraordinary nuclear engineer, academically, operationally. I was most impressed in his biography by his commitment to and imagined ownership of USS Enterprise as somebody who steamed in Enterprise's wake for many months across the course of my career. His operating, overhauling, and refueling and decommissioning Enterprise gives him a stake that I think is probably unequaled by anybody else. So I'm looking forward to this maintenance discussion, and with the kinds of changes that have taken place since November, of course, the different perspectives that it's now possible to apply to the way the Navy is going to go forward and the way the services are going to be funded. It'll be very interesting, at least to me, and I'm sure to you, to have these people, these experts, talk about where maintenance is going in their estimation here in the middle of January. So, Admiral?
All right, thank you, Lee. I'm on? Okay. Well, thanks for that very kind introduction. So I did read the Vice Chief's remarks yesterday about current readiness, and I read SecNav's remarks afterwards about the fleet and discussing the Vice Chief's remarks, and I just want to publicly go on record saying that I agree with both the Vice Chief and the Secretary of the Navy. So if you haven't had a chance to see, I just put out my NASI campaign plan. It's actually at hashtag the real Tom Moore if you want to take a look at that. That's a joke. Nobody got it. Too bad. Anyway, so as Lee said, I've been in the job for about 7 months now, and I do want to talk, having a chance to do the future readiness panel, as I kind of called it this morning, it was important, but I do really want to spend some time this afternoon, and we have a very distinguished panel here to talk about the kind of the current readiness piece. And I think the Vice Chief got at it yesterday when he talked about the fact that, hey, the first dollar today would probably go to current readiness. And you know, when I came into the job, it was the number one challenge that both the Chief of Naval Operations and the two fleet commanders, when I went to talk to them, said, hey, you know, this is really our inability to get ships and submarines delivered on time is really having an impact. And if anybody read the article in the paper last week about this was the first time that the Navy had not had a deployed carrier since World War II, that didn't catch your attention, nothing will. And it was a direct result of our inability to get the George H.W. Bush out of Norfolk Naval Shipyard on time. And this is not meant to be a finger-pointing exercise, but the fact was she was in for an 8-month availability and ended up taking us 13. And that 5 months, you know, the net result was Ike stayed on station a little bit longer, which meant we ran that ship harder and, more importantly, ran the young men and women who are out there today volunteering and wearing the cloth of the nation harder. And ultimately, she had to come back, and you still have to get the ship ready to go in FRP, and we took a gap. And so, you know, we have, at any given time, NAVSEA of the 278 ships of the Navy today, probably about 1/3 of them are either in a private or public availability, a CNO availability, or in some sort of pure side CMAV maintenance that NAVSEA manages. So, what I like to tell my workforce at any given day is, hey, we own about 1/3 of the fleet today is under our control. And so our ability to get those ships and submarines out on time is critically important. So before I turn it over to the kind of the speakers here, what I have been focusing on with my staff and when I go talk to OpNav is, hey, there's kind of three key elements here to getting us back on track for the on-time delivery of ships and submarines. Number one is to understand what the true maintenance requirement is. And we have failed consistently over the last 10 years to match the requirement, to articulate what that requirement is so that OpNav could get the funding right. We have consistently been on the order of $600 to $700 million a year short in maintenance. And if you're $600 to $700 million short in maintenance every year, you're always going to have challenges. So there's a concerted effort underway, my staff and with the fleet staffs, with the naval shipyards, to try and get our arms around better understanding what the true maintenance requirement is at the time that we build the budget so we can better align those budgets. And then once I've articulated what that 100% requirement is, and I think I owe that to the CNO, then I can have a discussion with the OpNav staff on how much they can afford. And if they can't afford the full requirement, then I can tell them, okay, but for that amount of money, here's what I can give you. And today we're not having that discussion. So that's piece one. The second piece is once you've matched and given me the controls that I need the capacity in the naval shipyards to match the work requirement. And today, the naval shipyards, I do not match the capacity. I'm under capacity by several thousand people. The net result is things run late, or for instance, the most recent example, the USS Boise, we took a submarine, which was supposed to go into availability this summer, and rather than put her in inductor and keep her in the yard for an EOH that should take about 22 months and put her in there for 48 months because they don't have the people, we made a rational decision not to put her into the yard and focus on the work that we had because I didn't have the people. But the downside is I took a submarine who is now essentially a surface ship because without the maintenance, I can't submerge her. And so I'm going to take this ship, a submarine that is still an active duty ship and it's really not available to the combatant commanders. That's a problem. And I'm probably going to put it in our private sector in 2 years at a cost that's significantly higher to me than if I do it in the public sector. So the second piece here is to match the capacity that I need in the naval shipyards. And we're going to go work on that. And then finally, the third piece is, across the board, then we in NAVSEA and we in the naval shipyards and we in the private sector, you in the private sector maintenance business, we have an obligation to get more productive going forward. That may require some investments. It requires learning on our part. But all three of those things are important. And I can become the most productive workforce in the world, but without the right capacity and without the right funding, I still can't get there. So my message to my team and to OpNav is I need to go work on all three of those things. We're off working on those things now. And what I'd like to do is kind of come down the line here and let each of the panel members talk a little bit about what they're doing from a maintenance perspective and how they're kind of aligning to the three things that I just talked to you about right there. So without further ado, I'm going to start to my left with Rear Admiral Jim Downey, who is the commander of the Navy Regional Maintenance Centers and also double-hatted as C-21 within NAVSEA. So, Jim, over to you.
Thanks, Admiral. Good afternoon, everybody. Truly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. As the Admiral mentioned, I've got the Regional Maintenance Centers and execution for the fleet and for Admiral Moore and the modernization programs in NAVSEA under C-21. Part of that also includes the foreign military sales efforts for our ship efforts with our allied navies, and we own the ships cradle to grave. That's the basis from which I talk. There's a slide up there really just pretty much summarizes the key points out of the CNO's design, the Assistant Secretary's priorities, which have been the same in his long term in office. And I'm really going to speak to the center part, my boss's priorities, which is pretty clear what my priorities are, whatever he says. Now, it's about on-time delivery. I modify that to say couple different versions on time, on budget delivery, and I would certainly take it ahead of schedule and under budget if you can do that as well. That's not all in jest. That really is where we need to go. To execute that work, we have global regional maintenance centers. Our main workforce is in the home ports, of course. Norfolk and San Diego are our largest. Then we have Mayport down in the southeast. We have Rhoda, Naples, and Bahrain. And then centers up in the northwest and out in Hawaii. On the government workforce part of that, it's almost 50-50 military and civilian, about 3,000 military, a bit over 3,000 on the civilian side. And of course, we don't do that work in any way by ourselves. On the program side, sponsorship is pretty much 95 and 96 for the modernization programs, and then of course working with the fleet maintenance officers to get the maintenance packages correct. So what are we working on there? And I'll talk to some of our risk areas going forward. The priority one, on-time delivery for NAVSEA, really co-lead that effort with Ms. Sharon Smoot, who's on the panel here with us, and we are working across public and private yards on how we share our lessons learned and how we continue to get effective. If you sat in the new construction discussion this morning, the maintenance and mod trends aren't much different. So if you look at DDG 51s, you look at LPDs, and what you heard in that session is how you get a steady, predictable work. The trends on those programs are positive. We have the same trends on those same programs in the in-service fleet. And when I say in-service, we own about 75% of the whole Navy fleet. We do all the work in my area, except for the nuclear ships and MSC. And then we support whatever the nuclear yards need and the non-nuclear areas of the nuclear ships. So we see, you hear about cost overruns, you hear about schedule issues, but in the DDG 51 area and the LPD 17 area, we have very positive trends on how the work is going. It's not at zero. It's not at zero on schedule or cost for slippage or right on track, but it's trending towards that. And it's been a continuous effort over the last 5 years. And the last couple of years have really, we're seeing some significant improvements to where we need to be. Not necessarily the case in some of the amphib areas, PCs, MCMs, and multiple different reasons there. From some challenging ships that have had some breaks in maintenance planned activities over the years to smaller quantities and very challenging ships to work on that force you into, and the PCs and MCMs, very much serial work versus concurrent execution of the work. Very challenging to do some of that work. As I talk to the larger package, of course, we have a great partnership with SPAWAR. I see Admiral Ailes is here, Admiral Swall was here. All the PEOs are involved in getting these packages right. We talk about new construction this morning, but this effort, in addition to 75% of the quantity of the ships, this is 75% of the life of the ship, where the cost of all these programs executes over here in the maintenance and modernization side. So it's very, very important to achieve the operational on-time delivery. Some of the areas where we see risk. Getting the duration correct, getting the requirements correct that Admiral Moore referenced for the availabilities. Going through that process, there's been really very significant efforts over the last few years, and we have gotten better there. One of my COs is here, Dave Bauer from SurfMap. The SurfMap effort stood up 5-6 years ago. Leveraging carriers and submarines is really becoming an exceptional effort in the Navy in getting us to plan these avails correctly and getting the entire Navy to stick with the plan. We're getting into much more of a directed maintenance approach in those challenging ship areas to say this maintenance has to be done, you cannot defer it. Very important to go ahead and execute to the plan. In the duration, issues that we are having. Some of it comes down to we pretty much know what the modernization work is, and that work is repeat. And what I want to see there is learning curve returns for us on schedule and cost, where we really get more cost effective. In the open and inspect work, the growth and new work, we need to get better in forecasting, looking at all of the ships that we have executed, and why don't we have the proper reservations in, even if it's at 5, 10, 15% schedule impact, it's a schedule impact. And it's really in forecasting the unknown and balancing that schedule reservation with not giving the fleet maintenance officers and the operational commanders an unreasonable lengthy duration where we don't return the ships on time. So over on the duration side of getting the requirements right, it really is about those correct estimates and sticking with the plan. Another piece of that perturbates the plan, and I think we've done a lot better on this over recent years, is late adds to the plan. If we are not hitting the milestones and locking those packages, regardless of the perturbations on some things that folks will tell you got to come in with the latest technology, you're going to have deviation from the plan. And we have to just make sure that the plan has what the operational commanders need to meet the threat and go ahead and execute that plan. So we're seeing that issue, and we have room for improvement there. Another issue we see with the terabytes of data we collect is change control needs to continue to improve. What we see around the world, it doesn't matter. Some of the folks I talk with every day are probably getting tired of me saying this, but it doesn't matter what the ship type is. It doesn't matter who's performing the work. It doesn't matter where the region is, the home port. It doesn't matter how long it's been since you did an eval on the ship. If you incorporate change after 60% of the eval execution, you have guaranteed lost operational days. So there are needs and the curves in the data, and we need to adhere to that and make sure that we can see and manage the expectations with the fleet commanders if we do need to incorporate that change and go ahead and adjust schedules. So getting the requirements right, managing the change, and the last one I'll say is really, and we do pretty good on this, but stick with the plan. And to stick with the plan, what we're doing there is making sure we have in-depth risk analysis done both in the planning phase to show what the risks are, the mitigation plan for those risks, stick with that plan, and in execution. Part of it in execution is to make sure the fleet understands to what level we're going to mitigate those risks and how we're going to redeliver that ship. It may not be green across the board to 100% original new capability, but do we all understand what capability we are returning to? Have we agreed with that and stick with that plan? And as I wrap up on those comments and move down the line here, I will say it really is a very impressive group of transparent players here from OpNav onto the fleet. It is a pretty impressive thing to see fleet commanders speaking to each hull status and how they're executing, and supporting the work and the plan that's going forward. That I can't speak positively enough about. The work is challenging, but the Navy knowledge on the work and the leadership support for it is very clear and is on track to get an on-time delivery. So that part really is not part of the perturbation. So going into 2017, we have a relatively typical workload. We have about 36 ships in eval right now, and over 119 in planning, and hundreds of intermediate level activities to go ahead and execute worldwide. We'll stick with that plan and can't get to on time soon enough, and we'll continue to share those metrics and hit that goal. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, next up is Moises DelToro, who is the Navy Undersea Warfare Center Commander and also double-hatted as CO7, where he owns all the planning for submarine maintenance.
All right, so good afternoon. Excuse me. So it's a pleasure to be here. Last year when I was here, I talked a little bit about the challenges, at least that the submarine force is going to have in the future as we age, as the SSNs and our SSBNs age, and ensuring that we get the requisite life out of each of the platforms in order to support the fleet. So this year, I changed it up a little bit. Again, the boss's number one priority, of course, is getting submarines and ships out of availabilities on time. The focus, at least from a submarine team one perspective, has always been that, trying to maximize the operational availability of our submarines. Hence, the new direction and the new light that's been focused on NAVC as a whole in actually trying to improve our A sub O. As you know, Admiral Moore talked to it a little bit in his introduction, the mismatch between the requirements when we plan that availability in our budgeting process, and when we get to the point where we're in execution, we are typically, you know, $600 to $700 million, like the boss said, off in our requirements. So why is that? So there is a new asserted effort to go off and do a deep dive into trying to figure out why we are where we are. So Vice Admiral Moore is directed that we have a planning summit. So we will have a planning summit in February, the second week of February, where we get together the OPNAV staff, C-21 CMRC, NAVC-04, the fleet, to discuss the various planning activities, SURF-MEP, sub-MEP, and the carrier planning activities, to go off and try to figure out why we haven't really changed the needle in our ability to reduce the amount of lost A sub O days. So the goal is kind of threefold. One is to determine the root causes of that requirement mismatch. So we're going to look at the adequacy of our class maintenance plans and our technical foundation papers, right, amongst the carrier folks, the surface folks, and the submarine folks, and try to figure out if there are lessons learned amongst that to see how we could get better in the planning piece of our availabilities. And then review our processes that are required to drive those mismatches to zero, right? So look at our historical patterns by ship class, look at metrics, what are the right metrics to track. And again, the high velocity learning piece is something that's important in this planning summit as well. So each, you know, so SURF-MEF does a good job doing its, Team Sub does the same thing. Carrier planning activities are doing that, but I don't know, and I know the planning activities talk amongst themselves, but again, the lessons learned, how we can accelerate the lessons learned from one planning activity to another planning activity to lessen the lost A sub O is also a desired outcome of this. A second part of what I do, and this is in my Warfare Center hat, is this was under the direction of Vice Admiral Harlardis when he was NAVC commander, is he gave the edict to the Warfare Centers to go off and look at how the Warfare Centers could help the shipyards in some of the aspects of in reducing, you know, in aiding us in eliminating some lost A sub O. So the Warfare Centers over the past 2 years went out and visited all the various shipyards and, you know, spent about $2.5 million of our 219 funding to go off and figure out some of the innovative ideas out there to go off and tackle that would help the shipyards in their efficiency. And so that's actually bearing a lot of fruit in that, working with Sharon and NAVC-04, we now have the Shipyard Innovation Fund, and she has actually ponied up some money as well, so that the efforts that we started under the Warfare Centers could bear some fruit and try to, you know, come up with other eyes. I consider this the less sexy part of what we do. I mean, acquisition is all the gets the limelight, but it's what we can do in the shipyards to help reduce the amount of time it takes to do certain tasks, could bear fruit on a lot of what we do in helping the efficiencies in the shipyards. There are other innovative efforts that folks are also looking at, but what I ask each of you here, especially industry, is a lot of this work is happening at the warfare centers. I'm sure from an industry perspective, there are ideas that you guys have that can help us, as it's not really my task, it's more of a Sharon, in an FCO4 aspect, but there's got to be ideas out there that we could bring to fruition that actually help us in our execution in the shipyards. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Okay, thanks, Moises. Okay, now introduce Sharon Smoot, who is the Director of Industrial Operations in FCO4. Sharon.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to share with you that I lead this workforce of over 35,000 military and civilian personnel in the 4 naval shipyards across the country. And every day, these men and women perform some of the most difficult work we do in the Department of Navy and certainly within NAVSEA in support of our Navy. We repair, maintain, modernize, refuel, and inactivate primarily nuclear aircraft carriers and submarines inside the public yards in support of our fleet's readiness to execute our mission. We maintain strong partnerships with industry. I am more dependent on them than ever more. For the very reasons that Vice Admiral Moore shared with you earlier on the sizing of the public yards. But I depend on them not just for shipboard maintenance and modernization, the AIT work they do. I depend on them for the supplier base that they also represent, our vendors, and all of the efforts that we're doing under innovation efforts. Some of the best ideas are out there in industry and the academic community, and we need to tap into that stronger and faster. Some of the best practices and new technology in our workforce is brought in by this new innovation, given the workforce that I have the pleasure of leading the tools they need to be successful in serving this Navy. We've hired inside the public shipyards over 14,000 people in the last 5 years. I've not done that. And I've not hired as many people in, I think in 1 year, over 5,000 people in 1 year. That presents both a tremendous opportunity because of the talent that we brought in. It also provides a little bit of a challenge for me in how quickly I can get that workforce with that demographics up to speed to do the workload that we're doing right now, which is at a peak inside the public shipyards. So I'm focused on several areas, and I'll try not to repeat what my other panel members have said, but in delivering ships out on time, stabilizing our workload, balancing that workload, those requirements with the capacity, and as Admiral Moore stated, we are below capacity for the work that's in my program of record right now. And Boise is one of the reasons we did not induct her inside Norfolk Naval Shipyard, because we did not have the capacity, the people to put on that boat to make forward progress on and delivering her on time. Improving our planning, identifying and generating the requirements and getting that right up front is a piece of it. The piece that I also do is in generating the planning products that I have to go do the execution of the work. These are the technical documents that I do, how I resource each of the projects, how I discipline this team to follow the project management fundamentals that we use on the waterfronts every day. Included in that is logistics. And as I said, our partners with our vendor base, our suppliers, all the way to how I bring in and move material around so that I get the right pieces and parts to the waterfront at the right time. I also am focused on investing in this infrastructure. We have some of the oldest infrastructure in our public yards in the Department of Navy. Most of my buildings are well over 68 years old, well over 68 years old. I have a layout of a plant that was designed for building ships. I haven't built any ships in a public shipyard in a very long time. So the investments that Navy's making to modernize the physical plant, to invest in our IT infrastructure, to modernize the capital equipment that this workforce is using, to put new tools, automated tools, robotics, all of that new cutting-edge technology, a lot of which we're leveraging inside Navy with our partnership with our warfare centers, but also in industry, with a private industry that's building ships and other industries that are not associated with ship maintenance or ship building. we're going wide and broad in industry and academic community and tapping into this country's scientific knowledge to make sure that I give this workforce a fighting chance to be as innovative, as efficient as possible in order to meet the commitments that we have for the Navy. So some of the other areas we're working on, including disciplined processes, eliminating work stoppages, getting down to the are we executing our plan that we lay out, validating that the plan is actually a good plan, then execute to the plan. We must continue to invest in the infrastructure, but more importantly for me, investing in this workforce that we've brought on board. We've placed a tremendous effort in developing and expanding what we refer to as learning centers in the public shipyards, where we've taken parts of ships components, and developed mock-ups where this workforce can learn and practice in a safe-to-learn environment and get proficient at doing the work that they're doing before I put them on the ship to actually weld, fit pipe, and do all of the work that these artisans are trained to go do, and we're seeing returns on that investment. So by using these mock-ups of these components and ship systems, we give them what they need to learn faster instead of taking 1 to 2 years to get someone we've hired out of the classroom and onto the waterfront. We're doing it in weeks and up to 4 months. Not in all cases. I have some part of my workforce that require even more training because of the complexity of some of the nuclear work we do, but for the large part, we are accelerating getting that workforce through training and being productive on the ship. I've been in this business for over 30 years now. I don't like to admit that in public, and I realize I just did. But I'm still in awe of the talent that we have in our industrial base, both in the public sector and private sector. And I hope everybody appreciates what that workforce does for this country every day, because they're the ones at the pointy end of the spear getting it done for us. They're passionate about the work, they understand the Navy's mission, and they are a critical part of the force behind the fleet. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. For those of you who don't, Sharon was only 10 when she started working at NAVC, so it'll make you feel a little bit better. So it's my pleasure also to introduce our Coast Guard here. Admiral Bruce Baffer is the Assistant Commandant for Engineering and Logistics. And Bruce, welcome to the panel. Over to you.
Thank you. First, I just want to say thanks to Admiral Moore for inviting us, and also to SNA for giving us this platform. We use this platform to communicate with industry, and we tend not to attract as much press by ourselves. So by combining and partnering with the Navy and with the SNA, it gives us a good platform. I've been speaking on these panels for, 5, 6 years, and I've always talked about OPC. This gave us a platform to talk about our acquisition strategy, communicate with industry, communicate a very different acquisition strategy that was using better buying power, and it's worked out great. It's worked out fantastic. We're down selected. We're in detailed design. It's the biggest program in Coast Guard history. It's the biggest program in DHS history, so we couldn't be prouder of it. So it's going well, and I know it's because this SNA panel was a big piece of it, so thank you for that. But now that I'm not in acquisitions, I'm in maintenance. I'm not going to talk about OPC anymore. Admiral Haycock talked about Polar. That's the new big thing on our plate that he's working on. But I'm into maintenance now and sustainability, so I'm going to talk about money and how we make some of those money-based decisions. We all know about the bathtub curve and the life cycle cost of any assets, all based in sustainment. It's not the acquisition cost. So if you look at it, acquisition cost, fixed cost, or a sunk cost, can't get that back. It's already spent. The crew's on board the ship. You've already paid them. You can't take them off. Fuel, okay, it's a variable cost, but it's relatively non-material when you're looking at the life cycle cost. The only thing that's left is really the maintenance accounts, the maintenance costs. So we always tend to go there first and try to squeeze that. Well, one of the things that's going on is, obviously we've been hearing a lot about operating government like a business, especially since the election. We want to operate the government like a business. The Coast Guard, the last 3 years, we've gotten a clean financial audit. We spent a lot of time doing our books, doing our financial statements, and we've had to think like a business. So I want to talk a little bit about how maintenance funds and maintenance activities would be looked at from an accountant's point of view rather than an operational commander. Right now, we've got 2 fleets in the Coast Guard. We've got our new fleet, our national security cutters, and our fast response cutters, brand new, coming out the door on time, on schedule. We're very proud of them. They're doing a great job underway. We've also got the legacy fleet. We've got the 40-year-old Polar Star breaking ice into Antarctica today. They're 10 miles into a 68-mile run, but they're still working, so we're crossing our fingers on that. Their ice is still breaking. We've got our 45-year-old HEC fleet, our high-endurance cutters, that's being replaced by the NSCs. We've got our 50-year-old 210-foot cutters. So we've got new ones and old ones, and we're maintaining them both. But when you're talking about the drug war, and I'm going to talk specifically about the drug war because it's easy to kind of calculate a return on investment. It's easy to quantify drugs because there's a street value and you can figure out how much you got. It's not like saving lives. It's hard to put a value on a life. So I'm going to talk about drugs a little bit. The business of counter-narcotics trafficking is big. Coast Guard has been setting records right and left. Last year was a record. So far this year, we've already interdicted 40 tons this fiscal year. So it's going to be another record. We see that coming. So anything we can put, if it floats, it's in the Western Hemisphere. It's off the Eastern Pacific chasing drugs right now. So everything we got is out there. Operational Commander would like to have a national security cutter. They've got all the intel capability, all the tools. They've got every club in the bag out there doing the job. We've also got our 210-foot cutters. Well, they don't want those so much, but you know what? You got to be present to play. It's just like going to MGM Grand. You know, if you're not there, you're not playing. You got to be there. There's no deterrent effect at the pier with counter drugs. You got to be there to interdict. So if you connect a 210 to a national security cutter, you can leverage that capability that the new cutter brings you by putting an old cutter with them. Well, okay, so they're not very fast. They don't have as long of legs. They're 50 years old. They do have a use of force helicopter. They do have our new over-the-horizon cutter boats. So they've got the same interdiction capability as the national security cutters. Well, how would an accountant look at that? National security cutter, $600 million, design life of 30 years. That's $20 million per year, straight line depreciation. So say they come back with $200 million worth of drugs, they'll divide that by 200 million in depreciation. That's a 10-to-1 payback. Okay, that's pretty good. We'll take that. That's running like a business. Well, let's look at that 50-year-old 210-foot cutter. It's depreciated 20 years ago. It's no longer depreciation. Okay, so they're not as good as the NSC. Maybe they don't get as much. They got $100 million worth of drugs. Well, 100 million divided by 0 is infinity. Their return on investment can't even be calculated, because that thing is 20 years past its design service life. And if you think about, cutter mortality, it's just like human mortality. It's a normal curve. You get your expected life expectancy. That's the cutter design time. The human, it's a normal curve. Some folks, if they maintain themselves, if they practice healthy lifestyles, if they go to checkups, if they pay the maintenance, they'll be out on the right-hand tail. That's what we all ascribe to, is to be on the right-hand tail, that normal curve. Unhealthy lifestyle, they don't do the maintenance, they don't see the doctor, they're going to be on the left-hand side. Cutters are no difference. So why is it that an accountant will look at our 210-foot cutters and say, we want more of those, we want more 50-year-old cutters, because look at that return on investment, as opposed to the new national security cutters? Well, that's how a business will look at it. But, we can't maintain those 50-year-old cutters forever. They're going to go away no matter how much we maintain them. The only reason we've been able to get past that design service life, and these cutters haven't been slept. We just did 2 midlifes. So, as the click and clack, the car talk guys, they would say they're in the third half of their program now. That's what they would call it, and that's where they're at. We just did 2 midlifes. We put the maintenance into them, and we're able to operate them out to 50 years and still get operational results from them. So that's what we're doing now. But the only reason we can do that is because of the maintenance. Who's seen that? Remember that Fram commercial with the pay me now or pay me later byline? Yeah, I know. I'm not the only old guy in here. You guys remember that. That was the all-time best commercial. The guy's over the front of his hood of his car, and he's got that $5 Fram oil filter in his hand. He says, pay me now, $5 Fram oil filter, and he takes a yank on his chain lift, and the engine rises up, half an inch, or you can pay me later. That's the business we're in right now. Pay me now or pay me later. That's what I have to do within the Coast Guard to try to fight for the maintenance dollars. And frankly, I'm benefiting now from my predecessors who made that argument successfully. And that's why we've got the 50-year-old cutters that are still operationally effective. One last story about those 50-year-old cutters. The first-in-class Reliance, it's a Reliance class, that was my first ship when I was a student engineer. I was 20 years old, it was 20 years old. We couldn't get past Guantanamo without breaking down. We would leave from Cape Canaveral, we'd break down in Guantanamo. They were designed for 14 days to 21-day patrols. That's what they were designed for, doing fisheries. We'd break down in Guantanamo, we'd come back to Base Miami Beach, we'd get fixed up, then we'd float back up the Gulf Stream and park it at Canaveral, and that's the end of patrol. Return on investment was 0. Okay? That's when it was 20 years old. It's 50 years old now. It's our oldest 210. It got underway last summer from Maine, went down through the Caribbean, through the Panama Canal, out to the East Pac, did a whole patrol at the East Pac, brought back drugs, brought back detainees, did the whole mission, back through the Panama Canal and all the way back up to Maine, routinely, without any big major issues. We expect that of those ships now. So you look back, you go, why can that ship do that now that it's 50 years old when it couldn't do it when it was 20 years old? What's the return on investment on that ship right now? So let me just leave you with a couple thoughts. One, maintenance pays. You can pay me now or pay me later, but maintenance drives operational availability. Operational availability drives mission performance, and mission performance drives that return on investment. And that's what the American taxpayer demands and requires of their Coast Guard. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. I'm taking copious notes on return on investment here. Thank God I didn't know that before we retired CVN 65. And thanks for clarifying that it is possible to have 2 midlifes. I just was trying to do the math on that. I would also note for the record that the Coast Guard was the first person to bring up the new casino in Washington, D.C. So, okay, sorry. So we're also glad to have our ultimate customer here, the fleet, and so I'd like to turn it over to Rear Admiral Mark Whitney, who is the N43 working for Admiral Davidson. Mark, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to come and give you the fleet perspective. And so throughout this conference already, you've heard from Admiral Roden, you've heard from the Vice Chief, you've heard from SecNav. I believe my boss is going to be talking at the banquet dinner. So I'm not going to presuppose the fleet perspective, so I'm going to give you the fleet maintenance officer perspective. So quite simply, it comes down to the fact that there's a reason why maintenance is the first phase of OFRP. Accomplishing the maintenance and modernization right up front, right at the very beginning, is what sets our sailors up for success throughout their training workups and deployment. You have to start there in order to get to success at the end in mission. So the title of this was also tied to delivering on time. So delivering the right maintenance to a ship gives the sailors the trust in their ship. Delivering the right modernization gives them the tools that we want them to have to pace the threat while they're out on deployment. Delivering all of that on time gives them the training opportunity to then figure out how to win and fight through, hopefully not, when they're on deployment. So this is all about giving them the right tools, the right capabilities, the right opportunities to be successful on deployment. What we've all seen, though, is when we do not deliver on time, we start making trade-offs. And in most cases, some of that risk has always been taken in the training time. Not without understanding what those risks are, but that's something that as we continue to see the change in the demand for the fleet and the mission sets that the fleet is going to have to be facing, sometimes those risks are going to now be unacceptable. So that's something that we're going to have to all think about. So as I've listened to my peers here and the panelists talk about it, and you may hear my boss talk about it, readiness, capability, and capacity are inextricably linked together. We have historically viewed them as separate silos and have paid attention to them somewhat independently. We'll put a little here in readiness, we'll take a little bit away from capability, or we'll sacrifice some capacity. In order for us to ultimately be successful, we're going to have to do a much better job at balancing between all three of those. And the priorities that Admiral Moore spoke to up front, some of the things that we're working on to make sure that we're clearly articulating requirement, clearly articulating risks, that's exactly what seniors need in order to make effective decisions. So, based on that, I'm ready for questions. Thank you.
Okay, so just a couple follow-up on a couple of things, and I'll throw some additional thoughts out here to the panel here. So we talked at the beginning about the improvements in productivity, and the CNO and his design for maintaining maritime security talks about high-velocity learning, or achieve high-velocity learning, and it's also in the NAVSEA campaign plan to create a high-velocity learning environment. I'd like the panel to address in each of your respective areas, if you care to, where you see us going in terms of high-velocity learning, and how is that philosophy impacting our ability to train our workforce and get more productive today? And I'll just throw that open to the panel.
So I'll talk specific to the public shipyards and the initiative of high-velocity learning. It's tied a lot to the investments we've made in our production workforce training in these learning centers. So high-velocity learning is not just let's learn faster. It's also about the method that we use to learn. It's about understanding how to see the problems and solve the problems, not just mitigate the problems. And so the example that we use with our workforce who is on the waterfront every day, looking past things that are in the way and getting around things that don't work for them, is instead of driving around the pothole in the street, fix the pothole so the person that comes behind you doesn't have to land in it or drive around it too. My workforce lives in an environment where there is inefficiencies all around us, and they have learned over years to work around those inefficiencies. So we are teaching them how to be vocal and identify to us what's not working for them, what processes are not working for them, what policies are getting in their way. Whatever it is, bring it to me, and I will work on removing that thing that's getting in the way of us being productive. Another aspect of high-velocity learning is how quickly we are sharing best practices and lessons learned across the industrial base, not just public shipyards, across the entire command, across each enterprise, across the Navy, across the Department of Defense, and in some cases across all of the agencies. Because there's commonality in a lot of what we do, whether we're maintaining tanks, maintaining aircraft, maintaining ships, and we are not learning from each other fast enough to get up in front of the curve.
Yes, thanks for the question, sir. Speaking for the private side of this, and I probably failed to recognize in my opening remarks, my main partners here are all of our private shipyards. They operate in an extreme high velocity environment right now. The environment I put them in is they get contracts awarded at about A-minus 60 days before starting the availability. And that's the goal, to get it to 60 to 90. So to allow them to be a bit more effective and to affect the material flow and that work, I've got to double that award at a minimum. To leverage the velocity that's there, I got to improve on the award cycle. on the planning for the maintenance, from really our core force multiplier here, the sailors on the ship and sailors on the RMCs. We have a really significant training program, the NAMPS program underway, does the eye-level maintenance to a significant degree, and really does the teach a man to fish issue. They teach the sailors how to properly prepare their CSMPs and how to maintain their equipment. So I've got to continue on that effort and pick up the pace there a bit so that we get as far in advance quality package that comes in from what the ship knows, what the crew knows about the ship. The other area to affect HVL really is we have a long way to go on our IT infrastructure for the work we do together, the work we share, or the terabytes and terabytes of data that we all have about what has occurred in the availabilities. That is we have a mountain to climb there, to be candid. There have been some improvements in recent years, but all the right parties don't have access to all of the right information. Therefore, the analysis hasn't been done to figure out how we go quicker with that information. So a couple of areas that we need to work on there, but I'll say again that the training related to the sailor piece is really on a very positive path right now, a 5-fold increase in the throughput of the trailers and training in the last 5 years.
Yeah, so from a Warfare Center perspective, I'd like to, I've been amazed here in the last, I want to say 6 months. So talking about IT systems, so I don't know if many of you are familiar with Infusion, so a tool that was actually a spay war tool that NAVSEA piloted at least at the Warfare Center up at Newport about 3 or 4 months ago. And speaking of how this is a generational thing too, so the millennials, and when you look at a Warfare Center that at least in the Undersea Warfare Center about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 folks, but you combine all the warfare centers and we're up at 20,000, workforce of about 20,000 folks. And you look at the percentage of millennials, and honestly, it took off like fire. So I kind of liken that, you know, if the older generation gets out of the way, the younger generation will figure out how to do high velocity learning. So we actually have a tool in place now that is actually grown pretty well amongst the warfare centers that looks, so it's a tool that allows the government, within the government lifeline, to do a wiki. So you got a wiki page. And, you know, I've never used wiki really other than Googling for something and Wikipedia shows up, but the younger generation knows how to use this stuff in chat. And the young lady up at Newport that actually showed me how this tool worked, it was amazing how energetic she was. And she gave me an example of a project that she was working on, and she tried to go within the division to find an answer to a specific problem, and no one really knew the answer. And she put something out on Infusion, and within an hour, she had a response from somewhere across the United States working in a different warfare center. So I think we have a long way to go, but Infusion is a tool at least the warfare centers can use to kind of help in that high velocity learning.
Yeah, when it comes to high velocity learning, what we found is it's all about repetition and going down the learning curve. And this is frankly something we learned from the private sector. New build it's about the learning curve and the power that learning curve gives you with repetition. Historically, at the Coast Guard yard, we've got our own yard. The ship would go in there and it would have a budget set, and they would work till they ran out of money, and then it would go back out. So then the next ship would go in, do similar work, had the same budget, and they would work, they run out of money, then would go out. And so then when you looked at that, you'd say, we have a zero learning curve at the Coast Guard yard, because they would just work until they were, you know, out of money, and then the next would come in. So we did a couple of things. One, we started treating the yard as a contractor as fixed scope. You've got the fixed scope, and it goes, the ship goes in there, and then when that scope is done, the ship leaves out. So we expect to see reduced labor hours on each one. The other thing we did is the work that we're giving the yard is repetitive in nature. They're doing all of our midlife. So we're doing midlifes to 140-foot ice-breaking tugs right now. They're doing all 9 of them. And we're seeing learning curves between the first one, the second one, the third one. We're doing the same thing with the 225-foot buoy tenders. The 175-foot buoy tenders will be right behind. But the idea is to use the work at the yard that goes on over and over and over, and take the advantages of that learning curve. Not just send it out to a commercial yard, to 9 different commercial yards, and suffer the first in class or the first availability, the first midlife 9 different times. So we do those at the yard. The other thing we did is we took our 87-foot patrol boats, or small patrol boats. We're always, we've got 69 of those things. We're always turning those things around. So we've always got 2 patrol boats at the yard, and every 30 days, one of them wraps up. So we have the same crew that goes from one, does the overhaul, moves right to the next one, does the overhaul, next one comes in. So it's a perpetual cycle, and we're really interested to see how low we can get that learning curve, because at some point it's going to taper down. But it's been really aggressive so far. And so we're using the the value and the power of a learning curve in a government facility is really where we're trying to put the high-velocity learning to practice.
So my only comment would be, I agree with everything that everybody said here, and it's the challenge for leadership is to make the status quo more challenging than trying something new. Yep. Have you heard that before?
I have heard that before. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so second thing, and then we'll open up the floor to anybody that might have questions out there. So, coming from the acquisition world, in the construction and new construction industry often is incentivized to make investments in their facility because it drives the cost of their product down and therefore makes them more profitable. Or by making investments in their facility, they get more additional work. For instance, if they add additional blast and coat facilities, they might get work on Columbia. Things like that. We don't have the same similar analogy over on the repair side of the house. Clearly not in the naval shipyard side, and probably to a limited extent in the private sector side. So I'm interested in your thoughts on what investments need to be made in your particular area, and how we might incentivize the government to make those incentives, those investments going forward.
I'll take that one on for several. I'm not sure. How many folks are here from the private yards? Can you raise your hands? Are involved with them? The common issue I tend to hear is a stable, predictable work is what will benefits us the most. They tend to not get into the facility issues. The facility issues are part of to be competitive and required by that the yard is facilitized. But I'm sure there are issues there that we can probably incentivize them to come forward with what the key areas are. The theme I get over and over is the change within the avail is number two, but it's year to year. And a larger incentive there. Very difficult issue to plan with annual appropriations. We buy the modernization efforts via 3-year money. And that generally works on getting the equipment procured, and we execute the balance of all that work in a yard with annual appropriations. And depends upon how the budget goes for that year. Very, very hard to meet the requirement of stable, predictable work when you couple all of those elements. So I think that's one area that we can, getting these requirements right as we go across the 355 number, I think that'll bring them a lot of benefits to everybody.
So in the public shipyards where we are responsible in partnership with CNIC and NAVFAC for the actual infrastructure, the investments that we need to make and we are making is in modernizing those facilities. There are challenges with those facilities because of how old they are and the standards that we are required to keep in each of the geographic regions working with the local communities. But we are making those investments and integrating those big investments in MILCONs with the actual work that we're doing on the waterfront. So we need to continue doing that. That gives everybody a safe and modern facility to work in and allows me to have an opportunity to redo the laydown so that the flow of work in our back shops are more effective. The other areas are in our industrial plant equipment. I have some very old equipment that desperately needs replacing, and we compete for those dollars inside Navy, just like everybody else. So my ability to offer return on investments, when I can put in 3D imaging equipment where I can automatically give that information to another tool that can, with precision, do the pipe bending for me, where I get first time fit up correctly for shipboard, that's where I need to go. Where I can take out of my back shops the hand cutting gasket, old molds, wooden molds we used to use, and replace that with automatic digital cutting machines, taking a 3.5-day job down to 3.5 minutes. That's the immediate return on investment I need to make. I need to get this workforce with help from industry and the academic community on how to use not just the exoskeleton technology, but robotic technology that can get in confined spaces, that can do welding in tight areas and get me first-time quality all the time, eliminating some of the uncomfortable environments that I put people in, and to some extent, or to a large extent, getting to first-time quality, eliminating some of the human error that is just indigenous in the work that we do. So those are just a few examples of where we would take, could take some investments today in the infrastructure, and what the return on those investments would be.
It was great to hear you say return on investment, because that's how we use it, we sell it. If you can demonstrate the return on investment in the maintenance, it pays back in terms of operational availability, then it sells, and it sells itself, and we're able to get the funding to facilitate our yard.
Okay. With that, we'll open up the floor to any questions that anybody might have.
Pat Piercy, Surfland. So I want to first thank the maintenance community, because I've been the benefactor of what our professionals have done in our public and private shipyards. Complex overhaul, 2 years, and activation of a CGN, ROH on a carrier or a cruiser, SRA on a cruiser modernization, a DP on a carrier, and a P on a carrier, all on time. You know, so as we're working together as a team, I want to be able to go and say to, you know, to the young officers here, when they come back and they say, you know, 10, 20 years down the road, I've had the same experience, all on time. So what is it that the fleet, the waterfront, what can the waterfront do as part of the team here to get us to where we want to be on time or earlier and under budget?
Thanks for the question, Pat, and great to see you here. We usually are discussing other things than these nice, pleasant, or talking about how we get boilers finished on Kearsarge or WASP. No, I can't say, not because we're in a public forum. What a great teammate and leader. The Admiral is great community. You know, one thing I do see, and it goes to some of my deficiencies in planning, I do generally tend to hear, hey, things got added by the port engineer, or there was not a great quality CSMP. My response back to my team is, well, if we've heard about that 50 times over, why wasn't there a reservation over in the planning process to handle that? So some of those common late add issues, more in the maintenance area, always need work, but it does not seem to be a major perturbation of what we're doing. And I also say, nor does there appear to be major perturbations in the baseline to meet the fleet commander's baseline requirements for the threat. I will say there are a lot of hands in the mix in putting the contract or the work package together. I do see that, whether they're small changes or large changes, there are many different levels, and you sit there as a flag officer, you think you're in charge of all of it, and you find out you're in charge of none of it. About 16 different people wrote jobs in 2 weeks before we awarded the contract. So I think we all need to work harder together on visibility and configuration management on that baseline, and adhering to the baseline and executing the plan.
Yes, sir. Over here.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Kipps. I'm from here from Bremerton, Washington, so home to the largest naval shipyard, Ms. Smoot. I represent the Puget Sound Ship Repair Association, and I'm asking this question. Really, it was teed up for me by Admiral Downey. So this is probably mostly for Admiral Downey, Ms. Smoot, and possibly Admiral Whitney. We've heard over and over at several forums, this one included, that the naval shipyards are very stressed. We have a process now with industry, navies meeting regularly with CNRMC to talk about things like workload for private sector and how do you keep a robust industrial base. But the question that occurred to me at our meeting with Admiral Downey on Tuesday was that in a port like ours, where the naval shipyard is very large, private sector is relatively small, we will go through periods where we know the naval shipyard is struggling to get their workload accomplished, yet the private sector is in dire need of work. And I'm wondering what we might be able to do, what your thoughts are on what we might be able to do to find a more holistic way to look at both the private sector workload, the shipyard workload, take the war, compare it to the graphs that CNRMC produces, and could we get earlier into discussions on where the private sector could help the naval shipyard with their workload problems?
Thank you for that question, and good to see you again. I would tell you just to keep the dialogue open in each port that we're working in. The workload graphs, both public and private, are important for us to assess, understanding where there is capacity and capability, and what contracts are available for all of our partners to compete on is important. We make our workload needs known by port, and we use the contracting process to identify what workforce or work we're looking for help on. But keep talking to us about what you see in your profile, your business base of work ebbing and flowing, as I'm aware it is doing in multiple ports, and we'll keep working together to see if we can stabilize. It's for all of our benefit to have predictable, stable requirements. We need you there, and we're thankful that we have that industry in Bremerton supporting topside work on carriers now, and as they are in several ports that we have carriers home ported. A few other limitations on what workforce, what industry I can bring in, and how much work I can do on nuclear submarines, but on nuclear carriers, we're all in it together.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Captain Sean Kearns. I'm the Pre-Com XL of Michael Monsoor, DDG 1001. Not a shipbuilding question, really, just in discussions with peers on the waterfront who've either in the midst of avails or coming out of avails. And I think this may somewhat relate to the well-known challenge that we're facing in industry with the departure of a highly experienced but aging workforce, and a generation of sailors that are getting out that didn't grow up in a SIMA world. That one of the drivers pushing ships beyond deadlines on avails is rework, not growth work. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Good to see you. How's 1001 doing?
The crew's doing great, sir.
Awesome, awesome. So we're talking rework of ships in service, right?
Yes, sir.
Well, and I'll ask Sharon as well. I don't see a lot of that. I don't see, as I'm coming out of folks about a decade of new construction, I don't see much of that at all on the in-service side. I do see some, in unique cases, some procedural issues, and whether we have done the preps to go to the next phase of the execution, but I'm not seeing a lot of rework. It shows me that the yards are learning within the yard, and they're executing that effort. So I will tell you, I don't have huge rework numbers. My numbers are really in the growth and new work area.
So I would agree with that comment. While we do track that, both from industry, the public shipyard, and ships force when we're executing maintenance, it's not the largest part of thing that I'm wrestling with. Ensuring that we understand the material condition of the ship coming in, meaning what we have identified as CSMP, what you know is working right or what's not working right, and we have that covered when we're doing the work definition period of part of our planning. That gives us all the fighting chance of getting everything identified as best we can up front and integrated into a schedule. I don't, it happens, and I know we're all human, we make mistakes. I'm more concerned about the stuff that breaks at the most inopportune time, that's driving schedule that nobody touched. And that's the challenge for the entire community, to get in front of the predictability of the material condition of the ship. The amount of growth work, we're getting surprised by that sometimes. Our ships are aging. I'll just take off the table that our workforce is not aging. We are all standing still, staying young. But it's other things that are perturbating the plan more than the quality of work. There are larger things out there that we need to tackle.
Okay, I think we have time, unfortunately, for only one more question. Sir, I think you were next.
Matt McLaughlin with Rolls-Royce Services. I applaud the returned focus on on-time availabilities. I remember a time when it was the norm, and there's a lot of things that can derail an availability schedule. A couple of those are an incorrect or incomplete work spec, PCP, duration to getting PCPs correct and approved, process control procedures, and long lead time on materials. In the early days of the cruiser program, the Navy made an investment in the Aegis Common Equipment Warehouse, which main focus was to mitigate risk duration for availabilities. Over the years, the Burke class and the San Antonio class leveraged those class common equipments through the private planning yards, but the focus moved away from maintenance availability duration to kitting for material. Is there any constituency on the part of the service to review that model, stage the equipment that we know we're going to need, particularly now with the move back to fixed price environment? Second part of the question is, and probably the second and third, is there any intent to leverage the expertise of major OEMs in getting process control procedures right the first time, as well as reviewing class standard work templates and/or specific work specifications to make sure that they're correct from a configuration standpoint, get the right parts the first time?
Okay. Is there a fourth and fifth parts to the question? I just want to check before I get started here. So your question on material management is a key. I think anybody that's been through an availability will know that part of having the right plan is having the right material in place. I do think the Aegis model is a good one. The submarines over the year through the TRIPER program on the boomers has been something that's been successful. The longer aircraft carrier availability is through CARPER. So we are looking at opportunities to do that, to kind of resurrect some of that. That does require a little bit of investment up front. The other thing is we've gotten some experts in to kind of look at material management workflow at both in the naval shipyards, for instance. We know that's an area that causes work stoppage in the middle. And finally, the last thing is there's a concerted effort. I am now starting to meet with Lieutenant General Bush, who's the director of DLA, and try and get DLA and NAVSUP all kind of working together so that the supply systems themselves, which can be more flexible and more agile in the work environments that we're working in today. So I think your point's well taken. I think we are taking action in that particular area to try and drive that investment out. So I thank you for that question. As far as the tech specs and the UCPs, we have tried to drive home technical authority into NAVSEA headquarters, and by the stand up of the regional maintenance centers, and really kind of grow those back to what was kind of similar-like organizations that we were used to when you and I were young. Those organizations now have waterfront technical expertise, which allows us to get those specs written and negotiated and handled. And I think you're starting to see some of that pay off up front. So thanks for the question. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank the panel today for spending time talking to you about current readiness and fleet maintenance. So we've appreciated the opportunity to talk with you, and I'm sure they're available afterwards if you'd like to talk to each one of them a little bit further. So thank you.
Okay, we'll take a couple of minutes here to turn over the panels, and then we're going to talk about the comments at the end of this that are always furnished by our expert outside observers.